Hello, this is Derek Taylor from HISD 140, U.S. History to 1877. This is the final little lecture I'll give you for the semester. Um, I want to apologize. I didn't get to the lecture for last week. I apologize on that for the chapters over the Civil War and the year leading up to the Civil War led to it. But I want to give this video two reasons. One, this is the last video you're going to get to see of me and my face. This is the last time you have to see it. But also, just to remind you a couple of things, you're going to have several assignments done coming up. This is recording this the 24th. You'll have on the 28th and the 29th assignments due, the 28th and 29th and 30th, actually. So go over that in a second. The final for this week discussion module on Reconstruction, which I'll talk about in a second. And then the final, like the last exam 4, I think it's the 29th. And the 30th is due your essay, which I'll go over in a second as well. So I'm going to mix this together, a little preview of the readings um, for um, for this last week we have together and talk about those just a little bit. So let's well, before I get into that, let me talk about Reconstruction. So last two modules you read about, how the political system broke down. Remember, because there'd been this tension over slavery for a while. They'd lived with it for a while. But things shifted in the 1840s and 50s, and that had to do obviously with expansion because it changed the balance of power between the North and the South and Congress, and threatened to extend slavery, which again, the North was a free labor society, and so they didn't want that. The South wanted to. They mentioned this in the textbook. I don't know if you caught it. The South was trying to expand, by the way, not only west but south. They were trying to expand. There was talk about in the South about trying to capture Cuba or Haiti or some of these Caribbean islands that were already slaveholding islands or sugar plantation islands for the southern United States. So they were definitely thinking about expanding. And that brought about the political conflict when it seemed like finally to the Northerners that way the South is not playing by the rules. That's when they start to embrace the abolitionist movement, which they've never had much use for in the 1850s. That's what leads to the creation of the Republican Party, and then, of course, Lincoln's election signals to the South that they're not going to let them expand. That's when they secede. So you have this battle for power, which is caught up with slavery and everything else, and the Union. And of course, you have the dreadfulness of the Civil War, and hopefully the readings were good for that as well. Like, the transformative nature of it. And that's kind of what brings me to. I'll skip over that briefly to Reconstruction. Reconstruction is really important for the history of the United States because it's, in a sense, it's kind of like Reconstruction is kind of like a second founding. How is that? Well, just think about what it was like. 1865. Lee has just surrendered to Lincoln. The southern South is in ruins. The North has devastated southern, railways and things like that. They've destroyed its infrastructure as part of this, the first sort of foray into modern total war. And so that's another reason it's a modernizing war. But it means that, as it turns out, again, we'll get to this in a second. There's all these debates about what to do. Because first of all, and your textbook mentions this is good that mentions this. There's nothing in the Constitution that says what you do when you've had a civil war and how you reintegrate states. It's completely unprecedented. And there are differing ideas, as you'll see in the chapters and the readings in Major Problems. Lincoln and other Northerners want to bring the South back into the United States in I'll say easy way, but with less obstacles. Their goal is to reunify the country primarily. Then, of course, you have people like Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens was an old abolitionist hand, old evangelical hand from way back, who they're called radical Republicans because they blame this entirely on the South. They hate the South. They want to remake it basically in the North image. This is the big. They are sort of the moral authority. Of course, they were right, obviously, but in the aftermath of the war, remember during the Civil War, there's virtually no Democrats in the Congress because they all left the South. So the Republicans have a dominance in Congress that they've never had since. So they could do things they couldn't, that, they get away with if they had a Republican president. Um, and so they want to take this opportunity to sort of create a modern nation. And what they want to do, a couple of things is one of the ideas is that part of the reason why the Civil War happened is because the South and North were so different culturally and economically speaking. They had this idea that the entire country needs to be united as one sort of economic unit, one market. And then if they're tied together like that, there'll be too much incentive for something like this to happen again. And so this is one of the things they want to impose a wage earning economy on the South. They also, by the way, want to get the South producing cotton again so they can ship it off to other parts of the world like they did before the war. So that's kind of the Northerners' goals. And there are lots of actors in all this, as you'll see. African Americans have a very different set of goals. They've just been freed from horrific slavery. And, generals like Tecumseh Sherman, as they marched to the South at the end of the war, made promises to them that they'd have land. They expected they're going to get land from, from the old plantations they worked on. Idea is, hey, you're saying slavery is wrong. We built that stuff. We deserve part of it. What's going to happen, of course, and this is what gets us into the whole issue of Reconstruction, is Lincoln gets assassinated. His vice president Andrew Johnson comes to the fore. Johnson hated the Southern plantation class, but he's a Southerner. He's from Tennessee, but he was from the lower classes. He was a poor white Southerner, grew up, poor farmer. Hated the class that made the Civil War in the South, but he's also a literal. People use this term way too much. He's a literal white supremacist. Thinks African Americans are inferior, have to be separated, all that stuff. And so when he comes into office after Lincoln's assassination, he's the one who kind of sets the stage for what's going to happen later on, because he basically, because the radicals wanted to make real big demands in the South right away. He says no. He basically sort of, I don't want to say soft pedals, but allows Southern office holders to come back into the Union, or wants to. And this sends a signal to the defeated Southerners that, hey, they're not going to come down and stomp on us. Because in the immediate aftermath of the war, the Southerners, on the other hand, were terrified. They'd just been defeated. They'd basically been subjected to something like a military campaign of terror by the Northern Army. They thought the worst was going to happen. If the North had moved at that moment, by the way, to really impose like legal equality, it might have worked. But once Johnson got into power and sort of started signaling to Southern leaders that he wasn't going to do that, that's when things shifted automatically. And all of a sudden, you start to have Southerners start to begin a long campaign of reassembling the social order that existed before the war, subjugating African Americans. You'll see this in the readings and in the major problems, passing things like black codes, restrictions on things like freed blacks freedom to assemble, or freedom of religion. You'll see this actually in the major problems, and we'll show it here. I guess it will show it here. Let's take a look at this for a second. This is a oh, you don't see that. Sorry. Share screen. Sorry about that. Yeah, the black codes are this is the Louisiana black code. Let me put this up here. As you can see, this is a black code in which I've highlighted some of it there. This is, Section 6 here from 1865. No Negro or freedman shall be permitted to preach, exhort, or otherwise declaim to congregations of colored people without a special permission from the mayor or president of the Board of Police. And the reason why, of course, is that they fear blacks organizing themselves in order to gain their legal equality. So they're passing laws that violate the Constitution in order to do this. So you have these black codes sort of trying to reinstitute slavery, essentially. That's what that heading there says. Other things as well. You have a part of a speech by Thaddeus Stevens in 1867, because what happens is they get into a fight, the radical Republicans, with Johnson. They wind up winning. They actually try to impeach Johnson, even though he really wasn't guilty of anything impeachable. This is partly about Reconstruction. But they basically say the country has to be reshaped. And this is the key thing here, especially for the future of the country, because their idea is we need to use federal power to reshape the country. You have to understand, when the country was put together back after the revolution, it had been a sort of, fragile compromise among states that were much more loyal to their local states than they were to the United States. The protection of local differences, a lot of had to do with slavery, obviously, was part of that deal. Now they want to use the power of the federal government to override all that, to force the South to treat blacks equally. And that's what this speech essentially, he gives you. You read yourself, see what he says. It's fascinating to see the things they're talking about here, why they need to do that. It's very interesting in a certain degree. And you'll have images in here, by the way, cartoons about Reconstruction and views on Reconstruction of the North and South, which are very different, obviously, but views of it in the North. You also have views of feminists and suffragist voters who, activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, like a lot of these, I'm calling them feminists, suffragists is the proper term, middle class activists for women, thought that once Africans, freedom Africans got the right to vote and everything, they'd come next. Remember, all this stuff post-war, a lot of it comes out of the old evangelical milieu of the pre-Civil War era, where evangelicals are behind abolitionism. They're also behind social reform. If you remember, in some of the earlier chapters, the chapter on religion reform, they were trying to reshape immigrants, Irish Catholic immigrants in these cities. These are evangelical types who want to reshape these immigrants from Ireland, places like this. They're the ones who want to reshape society and make it into a modern country, to put in modern terms, social engineering to reshape the country. But you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, of course, they don't do that. There's simply not enough political capital at that point, not enough support for it to make it happen. But they expected that because they had supported, of course, abolitionism. You have a couple of excerpts here from people who were involved in the process of Reconstruction, because a lot of Reconstruction was financed by Northerners who came down, by, for example, the Freedmen's Bureau, which Lincoln set up initially as a sort of temporary thing, which the Republican Congresses made, give it a longer life. I think it lasted up through the 1877, if I'm not mistaken, and what their experiences were like, so you get a sense of these things. And of course, you get a sense of the terror that happens, because what happens, of course, is the Southerners begin a campaign of terror to try to put all this out of reach. The formation of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1860s by Nathan Bedford Forrest, which eventually they actually do begin to break down the worst of it in the 1870s. They do pass laws, but they're never really able. This is the problem with the Reconstruction era, is that, you're trying to, and as you'll see here, I'll stop that share there. I won't go through the rest of it. They're trying to impose, put in our modern terminology, a democratic size for us is total legal equality, right? They're trying to impose that on a country that doesn't want it, or people that don't want it. And I mention this because there's been a lot of change in the historiography of Reconstruction. It used to be viewed real negatively by historians, partly because of racism in the late 19th century. They tended to see the Northerners who came down to, rebuild the South and help freedmen as being sort of interlopers who were trying to make money off the poor defeated Southerners. That changed in the 1960s, when it's the 60s, so everything became more progressive. And those historians tend to take a much more, on the one hand, positive view of what they intended, a positive view of what they wanted to do, but they saw it as a failure, as to say, modern historians tend to see Reconstruction as a kind of attempted revolution from above by the government to foment social revolution in the South. The implication being, by the way, that what they wanted to do was connect Reconstruction with what was going on in the 60s and the Civil Rights Movement as being the completion of that. And a lot of interesting stuff. They mentioned a guy in the textbook, a man named Carl Schurz, and he was a general in the Union Army. He was sent by Andrew Johnson across the South to survey conditions and the opinions of Southerners just after the war. And when he came back, he wrote a report, and the report was basically that if enough force was applied, they could reshape the South, and it needed to be. And it's interesting, by the way, to put this in perspective, a couple of things about Reconstruction, just to give you a larger view on it. It's not a unique event. The idea of reshaping the country or reshaping, the polity, this is going on across Europe, by the way. The great revolutions of the 19th century in Europe involve the creation of a modern nation state in which local, cultures or whatever get sort of steamrolled by a more self-consciously nationalist vision of the country. Just to give you an example, if you have, in this case, of course, the North is trying to impose its vision on the South, right? In France in the 1870s and 80s, large parts of rural France were really backward. A lot of people couldn't read. A lot of people were not really, well, according to the people in Paris who ran the national government, weren't really French. They were more, Gascon. They were more loyal to their local areas they lived in than they were to the. So they began a campaign of building roads, but also schools and education. Um, to teach, for example, the local dialects in these places are very different than Parisian French, to teach them Parisian French, right? So it'd be more one sort of nation state, one sort of national culture. There was a famous, not famous, but it was a book written years ago by an academic called "From Peasants into Frenchmen." That was the idea, to turn them into people who were more local, that more loyal to their localities than they were to the center of the state. That's kind of what Reconstruction is an attempt of here in the 1860s. It's also been compared, by the way, Reconstruction has in contemporary terms to modern day attempts by the United States to attempt what's called nation building in countries like Iraq, other places like that, to impose democratic values, right? To impose, like, equality of today. I mean, equality of women, legal equality between religious groups, stuff like that. This is, some historians have seen this as the first attempt to do that. And of course, as you see, it's a miserable failure because the Southerners resist. As you'll see in the textbook and the readings, it's pretty clear the two things that undermine all this are: one, Southern resistance, violent resistance, the Klan and other things. It's violent, let's put it that way, as it was in Iraq. I failed there. Um, but also, people in the North got tired of it. There are a series of scandals, political scandals in the 1870s in the Republican Party. Plus, there's a depression that hits the worldwide economy in the 1870s, which all of a sudden, because one of the things, again, you'll see this in your textbook, Reconstruction is basically, it's a military operation. They literally divide the radical Republicans to the South up into military districts. They're governed by a military governor. It's basically, they treat the South like a conquered people. And again, you don't have to take a racist view of this to think that's probably not going to work. I mean, basically, they're going to resist that. Is the point. When they did successfully, unfortunately, for African Americans especially, they had late 19th century and early 20th century some of the worst eras in I think for African Americans because of it. But by the end of by 1877, the North, people in public opinion in the North has just turned against Reconstruction. It's been this big waste. And most people know it's been expensive. It's very expensive to keep armies in the field, even if they're not fighting. And actually, they were fighting, but it's also, of course, pointless if you have to hold together your country through military force. Which that's what the Southerners did. They basically forced the North to cry uncle. There was an election, a disputed one in 1877. You read about this; it's crazy. You think things have been crazy the last couple of years in the United States? It was crazy back then, where you had this disputed election, disputed electoral votes between the Republican and the Democratic president. And eventually, the disputed votes are awarded to Benjamin Harrison, the Republican, more or less in exchange for withdrawing the last troops from the South, and thus ended that attempt to reshape the country. That's why we leave you off in the story of our country. It stops at Reconstruction, when you could say that Reconstruction is half finished because legally there are laws, African Americans have rights and everything, but they really don't, not fully going forward. And so and the country is one country again, politically and politically and everything, but it's still divided. And so seeking that unity has kind of been a thing ever since, I guess. So in any case, that's my last overview of that. Briefly, just want to look at the assignments just to remind you guys. I'll post this and remind you again, but yeah. So briefly, the module on Reconstruction is due 28th, a few days. Exam 4 is due on the 4th. That should cover the last 3 or 4 chapters, I think. And then your essay on the 30th. So again, this should have the stuff in there. Again, and this essay is just to give you to think through the course, right? And what's important about the history of this period from, colonization all the way up to Reconstruction. And just to re-clear here, by the way, I give you an example of a thesis. I'll go through this, basically I want you to write an essay of 5 pages and defend a thesis. You have to defend an argument, right? A point you want to make, a big point, overall point, based on the sources in your major problems reader. That's going to be that's going to be the evidence you can use to support your thesis. And it's totally opinion, right? This is kind of vague, but I wanted to do this to give you an overall view of things in the course. And the question you have to answer is, in your opinion, what is the most important subject in the history of early American history, and why is it the most important? So again, because I want you to think through these things. I want you to really think about it because it's important. What's the most important thing? Is it our Constitution? Is that the most important thing about our early history? Is the most important thing that that our history bequeaths to us from the past? Is it something else? And and you have to do a couple of things here. Give clear reasons why you think this is the most important subject, and provide sources to support your reasoning. I don't give you a certain number. If you only cite like 1 or 2 sources from the reader, your grade's going to be low. More is better. The more evidence, the better, I think, for this. I want to see you grabbing evidence from different places to support your theory. And again, I expect you'll mostly select from a certain chapter. That's fine. But more than like 1 or 2, it needs to be. I don't think I did require. I think I did. Yeah, minimum of 6 sources. Yeah. So it can't be 1 or 2. It's got to be 6. And different types. 4 primary sources. I want you to cite essays too. 2 secondary essays, those essays in the end of the chapter. So you have to think about this a little bit. So, okay. And I even give you, I mentioned you should also address why other subjects aren't as important. That's another thing you can talk about. And I give you an example thesis. I should say the most important, says the important, but the most important subject in American history is the coming of the Industrial Revolution. Because it created a class society where none of it has existed before. That's an example you could take. You can't do that one because I gave it to you. But I guess you could do a variation of that, whatever. But let me know. Don't just do it. And then you structure the rest of the paper around the reasons why you think this to be the case. Some of you, an obvious answer would be slavery. Another obvious answer would be, by the way, I pick subject. You could pick people. You could say, if you want to say George Washington because he's the founder, you could do that. You want to do Abraham Lincoln, you could do that. If you wanted to do an abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison or Frederick Douglass, you could do that. Don't limit subject to impersonal things. So that's another thing to mention there. And again, essay, 4 primary sources, 2 secondary sources. No outside research is required. You shouldn't have to. You can if you want, but you must cite those 6 from major problems. You can also cite your textbook as well, but you're being graded on how you use the sources from major problems. So that's a minimum of 6 sources from major problems. If you want to use other stuff, you can, but those 6 have to be in there. And again, papers have an introduction, a body, a conclusion, format. You should have a thesis stated clearly in the paper's introduction, and a body that lays out the evidence, right? You're going to show me, okay, for example, say you go with Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was important because it changed the way Americans saw themselves. And you can give examples of how there are pictures in your textbook, if I'm not mistaken, of people taking photographs of them in their work clothes, right? Because all of a sudden they're their economic status, their occupation is really important to them in a way that wasn't important before the Industrial Revolution. It created, in other words, a sort of class consciousness. People, trust me, by the way, maybe you don't know what class, we tend not to talk about class in the United States, but I assure you, there's a class consciousness among academics and scholars who teach in universities. They definitely see themselves as a sort of higher class. So that's one of the ways we might emphasize that, but something along those lines, basically. And you have the evaluation down here, as that's due by July 30th. And that's basically all I have for you. Again, apologize for not having the brief intro to the chapters 13 and 14 last week. This chapter, last one of the semester, last week. No, it's been summer courses are always rough because you're cramming so much into a short period of time, but hope you guys have enjoyed this. Again, have any questions about any of the work before we get done, let me know. I want to say, oh boy, I don't know when grades exactly are due. You can find it on the JCC website. I know I have to turn them in, I think, by Monday. Final grades, I mean. I want to say it's either Tuesday or Wednesday when you'll have access to them through the My JCC portal. So that should be it. I should have covered everything. So without further ado, thank you everyone for your efforts who's struggled through this. By the way, congratulations. The first thing in life, by the way, to any sort of success is not quitting. If you made it this far, God bless you. That's the first thing. It's the first step, and you have to do it because when you're an adult, no one's there. You can always quit and fail, but you guys didn't. And by the way, if you didn't, some people did. I'm not judging anyone for that because college is tough. Life is tough. Adulthood is tough. But anyway, thank you guys for your efforts. Hope you got something out of the course, and hopefully I will see you guys sometime in the future. Take care.